thank you so much for joining this roundtable on the topic of investing in the quantum space. My name is David Sidler. I'm head of investor relations at Verve, and I'm going to be hosting this. So think of me as sort of the non-physicist in the room that will dumb things down in case our participants take it up a level which might be a bit too much for non-physicists to understand. So without further ado, I'd like to quickly introduce our four participants. So we have Mathieu from Qnami, we have Alexander from Kiutra, we have Olivier from Quantonation, and Emma, who's also in the Verve team with me. And let's start with you, Mathieu. Could you quickly tell us 2 words about yourself and about Qnami, please?
Sure. Thank you, David. It's really great to have the chance to participate in the roundtable with you today. My name is Mathieu. I'm the co-founder, one of the co-founder and the CEO of Qnami. We're a startup located in Basel. Maybe some of you actually on the other side of the screen know us already. The company was founded in 2017. We're backed by private investors, including Quantonation, and Olivier is here, and Investire, now Verve. We raised approximately 10 million now through 2 financing rounds and grants that we got from Europe mostly, and have accumulated revenue of around 2 million now. We're a team of 15 people, and Qnami customers are universities and companies working in the semiconductor industry, developing the next generation computer. And what we do is we help them develop new chips, bring technology which is in the lab to the fab by providing measurement tools that allow them to collect key data, allowing their scientists and engineers to understand and validate their new designs. And we do this with quantum technology, quantum sensing, which offers this unique sensitivity to the atomic scale.
Perfect. Thanks, Mathieu. Alexander, maybe why don't you go next? Tell us a little bit about your background and about Kiutra.
So first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to join the round today. And it's also great to see that there's so large interest in this subject, actually. I'm Alexander Regnat. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of Kiutra. Kiutra is a Munich-based spin-off company from the Technical University of Munich, incorporated in 2018. And our company provides cryostats. So you can think of cryostats as sort of high-tech refrigerators that provide ultra-low temperatures for research, development, and operation of quantum devices. And that is crucial because most of these quantum systems that we will talk about today a bit only work at these very low temperatures. So, and in contrast to our competition, Kiutra makes use of cooling principles to provide these low temperatures that work independent of cooling, liquid cooling media, notably independent of helium-3. And this allows us to build very easy to use and fast cooling equipment. So therefore we can help our customers from the industry and from research institutes to facilitate and accelerate their work, essentially.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Alexander. So I hand over the word to you, Olivier, to tell us quickly about Quantonation.
So I'm Olivier Tonneau. I'm one of the partners at Quantonation. And Quantonation is the first fund worldwide dedicated to quantum technologies. So we have done 14 investments to date. We invest in early stage startup. We are not shy of investing right from after a spin-off from the university labs. We cover all segments of quantum technologies, from computing, hardware and software, to communications and sensing. So we've started investing 3 years ago, and we are maybe one of the first in that segment. And we currently have raised for our fund a bit more than 30 million, and we will get to 60 to 65 million by the end of the year. So we'll have some more dry powder to reinvest in our portfolio companies such as Qnami. And we're glad to have looked at and done several investments along with Verve, and glad to look at companies in Switzerland as well. A lot of nice things happening in quantum in Switzerland.
Can you maybe say 2 words about, I mean, you invested in Qnami. What was your investment thesis for this case?
We know that quantum technologies can be long-term technologies and long-term investments. So we are trying to balance between very long-term projects and some more short-term projects. And Qnami was quantum, but with already traction and sales and product that are already bringing something to the client and doing better than their classical equivalent products. So we like very much the fact that Qnami was a very high-tech company, but already bringing some value to the client and already doing sales on this market.
Perfect. Thanks, Olivier. So I hand over the word to you, Emma, to maybe tell us a bit about Verve's quantum approach and also why your investment thesis for Kiutra.
And good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Emma. I'm an investment associate here at Verve, and I have a background in theoretical physics. And with that, I'm a bit the quantum enthusiast, at least within our firm. And at Verve, we clearly believe in this future quantum technology space, and therefore also would like to invest in this market. And I think on our side, we take a very holistic approach to this market. So not only looking at the quantum computer players or maybe the quantum sensing players, but also thinking about what the future supply chain will look like and what's actually needed to get to that future quantum industry. Also because we believe there's actually a lot of venture potential in these enablers. And that is also why we are currently investing in Kiutra, for example, because as Alexander already said, this cooling capacity is really an indispensable part of that quantum supply chain. And Kiutra really brings a new technology into the equation that offers a lot more flexibility and basically gives companies a new parameter to play with on the cooling side. And I think that interest, and that's also ties in a bit with Qnami's story, is already confirmed by a lot of players that are interested in already buying the technology today, while it also has a very big potential in the long term.
I think that's an interesting point you touched upon, Emma, and that's also something you mentioned, Olivier, that you try to balance sort of like the short-term bets with the long-term bets, things that now have application versus things that will take a little bit longer to develop. Question really to the two of you from the venture capital perspective. Why do you think now is the right time to focus on investing in quantum tech, Olivier? What's your take on that?
Well, first, it's the right time because the technology is not only research anymore, but we are more in a stage where the research has been done, and now it's more about engineering and developing the product and finding the product market fit. So for early stage companies, early stage funds like us, it's the right time because we are just at the time where the companies are going to spin off from labs and start developing and selling their products. Plus, well, people recognize that it's a very dynamic environment. There's a lot of financing coming from the States. I think the national, if you total the global national plans that have been set up in maybe a bit more than 20 countries, that's financing of more than 23 billion US. So there's going to be a lot of money to develop those technologies, both from public states and also if you look at the amount invested in quantum technologies in the last 10 years, actually more than 2/3 are in the last 2 years. And today we will be probably reaching the bar of $2 billion invested in quantum technology by private investors. So there's a momentum. The technology is there, and there's support from the states. So that's why we believe it's the right timing. I should mention as well interest from clients, large companies that are really ready to try the product and launch in collaboration with the startups.
Is there anything you'd add to that, Emma, from your perspective?
Yeah, maybe because I can totally echo what Olivier says there. And maybe it's also something that you can really observe in the industry, that you see different companies emerging now. So it's no longer a couple parties going for that long-term race of we are going to develop the next quantum computer. There are now also business models to figure out by players that provide certain components, or, for example, the emergence of ever more quantum software players, because they have the feeling that now actually they can already start working with clients, start to figure out, hey, what could quantum computing mean for you? And I think this is something that was not yet possible, say, 5 years ago, because the hardware was not at the level that it was actually imaginable what it could do in the coming, let's say, 5 to 10 years.
That's interesting. And maybe a question over to you, Mathieu and Alexander. I mean, both of you have PhDs in the quantum space. I mean, you guys probably started diving into this area more than 10 years ago. So, I mean, timing is right now, but you guys have been preparing for this for a decade or longer. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen the quantum space evolve from when you entered it to where you see it today? Mathieu, why don't you go first there?
Yeah, sure. So my background in quantum dates 20 years ago, and it's quite interesting that in the first place I didn't even think this would be an opportunity now. So it has evolved extremely fast. I think what the major thing that has changed over the past 10 years is that the technology becomes available. It was really nested in the labs, and now it's becoming available. The scaling of part of the technology, I mean, scaling remains a big question for some of the applications, but we've done a great step forward. If I look at our own example, 10 years ago was the first proof of principle that our type of microscopy could at all be done. And now 10 years later, you have a product that exists. And the way we got there is like my co-founder, Professor Maletinsky in university, got more and more interactions, more and more demand to work on this kind of funny idea, what was a funny idea 10 years ago, up to a point where this became a clear business case, and in about no time, right? 10 years is long from a company perspective, but from the market perspective, it's just no time. And the other thing which I wanted to mention, a big change in the market in the past 10 years, and I think this is fundamentally new in physics in general, is that there is a new generation of scientists who are now ready to look beyond fundamental research and actually take their research, take their physics to the market and consider a business with that. This is a major change compared to when I was starting my studies.
So you'd say scientists have become more entrepreneurial, essentially?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and maybe, I mean, just touching upon that before we go over to you, Alexander. I mean, it's pretty absurd to think that, you know, a principle which 10 years ago was created, that, you know, that scientists can say, okay, we're going to work on this and try to find a real world application. That I can understand, but then having big players in the industry say, let's take this crazy idea and turn it into something that we will work with. Can you say something about that? Like, do you see more acceptance from large players to also accept quantum technology as something that they work with?
Yeah, I think this relates very much to the fact that quantum is happening. You know, whatever the time it's going to take, it's going to happen. It's there. It's in nature. The technology has been around actually already for decades at a slightly different level, but it's happening. And now we're coming to this point where you can really have these quantum technology, which gives a huge boost and will lead to a disruption of the leaders in the high tech. So I think those large companies like the Googles and the IBMs, they felt that, and they knew they had to understand what's going on there and make a certain number of bets in certain technologies so that they can remain on top of the technology. It is clear that in the 20th centuries there will be new tech leaders, and some of them will be champions of quantum tech.
Great, thanks for that, Mathieu. So maybe question over again to you, Alexander. If you think about sort of when you started studying this space, and now that you're an entrepreneur, working on real world applications in the quantum space, how has it changed? And can you echo some of the things that Mathieu said, or would you add anything on top of that?
Yeah, I can certainly echo most of what Mathieu said and also what Emma already introduced. So I think what I can clearly confirm that it's widely accepted nowadays that the quantum tech is here and it's here to stay. So it's really accepted, and that's why we also see an ever growing community and really an ecosystem that is developing at the moment, which also now organizes itself in large research consortia on the one end. So, but that's more the academic part of that area. But there are also industry consortia, like the European Quantum Industry Consortium, the QBN, the Quantum Business Network, and similar structures that are now being set up, where people collaborate. And this really shows that there's not just a huge interest in the matter, but that people believe this is a technology that will be very important for our future success in general. So we see a largely growing number of market participants. And for us as a company, that really means that at the very beginning, we were mainly in touch with academic prospects, academic customers like we were at that time. So researchers that were using the equipment that we now built for their own research. And this has also changed a bit because we now see a lot more players coming into the game. So from the industry as well. So there are many new startups, of course, that are developing their own solutions in the quantum technologies. And there are, of course, the large corporates in the US, but also in Europe that are now dealing with the subject and with whom we are now in touch also as a supplier.
Nice. So, I mean, we started to get some first questions now from the audience. So maybe I think there's one or two that it's worth diving into now. I mean, we'll do this as we go along. But there's a good question here. What is a good simple example of quantum application? Something that ordinary people on the street understand and even already benefit from.
So maybe let me take one. So a good example, like I'm going to take our own example, right? So when you want to develop new chips in electronics, right now, because of Moore's law, we are at a level where the quantities of material that are used to make any type of bits or memory or transistor is extremely small, and the existing measurement tools to confirm design, to understand what's going on, are just reaching their limits. So that's a clear use case where quantum sensors and quantum measurement tools can really make the next step and allow these scientists and engineers to understand what's going on and then develop the chips that everyone will use in their cell phones, in their computers, etc. It is still a niche market, so it's not an application that a broad audience will use, but it has consequence for everyone.
Perfect. Would anyone like to add to that one?
Well, maybe just to paint a picture of it, it's quantum is not something that has never been in our lives. For example, you can even think of something like an MRI scanner as almost a quantum device if you kind of take it one step further. It's the same kind of principle of measuring magnetic fields, and we use that actually to paint an image. So you could even say that, okay, if we really cross the quantum barrier, so we go way smaller, that we just get to a much more precise picture of the body. So maybe now we can see a whole organ, but if we go further and we keep developing, we can just kind of zoom in on that picture. But I think it's good to keep in mind that it's not that quantum now all of a sudden starts to appear in our daily life, and you as a person walking on the street will be able to say, okay, but now that is quantum, that's not quantum. We know it already, but we will take everything one step further. It's the same with everything that is a laser, for example. Light is like a very fundamental unit of quantum, and now, for example, we go from a light beam, so just the whole light wave, we go to one single light particle to carry information, to run through our optical fiber network. So it's also not, it's revolutionary on the one hand, and on the other hand, it has already started, and it is already around you.
I have another very simple example.
Sure.
I think it was organized in Geneva. Some city elections were secured with quantum cryptography by ID Quantic already 10 years ago. Okay. And it really relied on this fundamental aspect of quantum that you cannot break quantum, like information which is encoded quantum in a quantum way. That happened already 10 years ago for elections in Switzerland.
Okay, well, that's quite a concrete example for sure. Maybe one question to the to Olivier and Emma. I mean, you mentioned this earlier, Alexander, that you have, it's not just startups, you have like big industry consortiums and everyone that's active in the space. And if you look at what's happening, you mentioned, okay, there's some real world examples, but a lot of the things that are happening are still quite niche, or they're in the lab, which means that a lot of the development in this space is about fundamental research or enabling fundamental research. So what is actually the role that VCs have to play in this versus industry consortiums, but also public funding? Would be interesting to hear your take, Olivier and Emma, but also you, Mathieu and Alexander.
Yeah, well, first, I would say that there are some segments of application that really are within reach. And when I say within reach, is within 2 or 3 years. There will be some real-world use cases. I'm referring, for example, to fields such as drug discovery or optimization in finance. And I mean, what we can do, for example, we have 2 companies in our portfolio, Multiverse and Pascal, that have signed a collaboration with a large French bank, Crédit Agricole. And it's a whole collaboration program for the next 18 months. And the idea was that's a very exploratory phase where they want to understand how they are going to be impacted and how their business is going to be impacted by quantum, and how should they prepare for that. That's one phase. And the other one is to start developing softwares. And the idea is that they should be used by the bank in 18 months and integrated into their everyday workflow for asset optimization topics. So what we can do, I mean, teams and startups are often founded by researchers. So what we can do as VCs is to take them to their client, try to have them work around real products and real use cases, and that's something that will help them develop and transform research from into product and markets.
Yeah, so I think actually the kind of the diversity in funding is very important for this industry, because there are very fundamental research topics that have to be covered to kind of enable this innovation in the long term. And maybe that's not something that has VC potential now. It might have in a couple of years. And this is where you can work with public funding very well, and where there's also kind of a job to do for governments if they want to push this further. On the other hand, you have the industry consortia that are also sometimes publicly funded, sometimes also privately, that are very important to bring those parties together. Like Olivier said, it brings startups in contact with the end users that can also kind of push their requirements, or at least say, hey, this is what we need for it to be useful. And I think if you then look to VC, it's actually interesting to also put that business mind a bit into this industry, because at some point it needs to come out of the lab, and we are now really at the stage where that is possible. We have the technology. It's not all figured out, but at least the challenges that have to be solved are kind of clear. There's a clearer path through engineering. And then I think it's also so good to have VCs in there that help you or maybe force you to translate your development into what it's going to do for society, and to have that customer interaction, and kind of putting that business mind, maybe that entrepreneurial spirits, into the scientists that are now open for it, as Mathieu said. I think that's also the role of VC within that industry.
Maybe Mathieu, Alexander, could you say?
Sorry, just one further point is that it's also an iterative process. For example, I mean, research continues happening while the company develops its product. And for example, at Pascal, they are commercializing a 200 qubit computer, atom-based, but in the research lab where the company originates, they are working on a 800 qubit machine. So it's all a process where research continues happening and will translate into the company later on. But I mean, this is very quantum cannot be made in the garage like most of digital startup. It has to be close to the labs, and this interaction between research and the startup is very important.
Maybe since you mentioned the 800 qubit computer, we have one question from the audience here, which is, what qubit technology approach do you see as likely to win the qubit race? Just a quick one to throw in there, since you just touched upon that.
We don't believe that there's a winner-takes-it-all approach to this, because these qubits are all very different, and you can actually put some measure that they do not have the same time of coherence, they do not have the same capacity to scale, they do not interact the same way. Some just with their nearest neighbors, some can connect to many other qubits. So all that different technologies makes it, let's say, you cannot implement all algorithm on the same way on the same computer. So at Quantonation, we believe that those technologies will be complementary and will tackle different problems. You'll be able to implement different algorithms, whether you're using ions, supraconducting, or atoms. And so they will all be relevant for some specific task and for solving some specific problems, we believe.
Okay, so maybe on that, because there's another question here on how investors compare the alternative, like the technological alternatives for qubits, superconductivity, ions, and photonics. So you say there's room for all, essentially, depending on the applications. Okay, perfect. So maybe if we go back to the initial question, which is what's the role of VC versus public funding and consortiums? We heard now the perspective of Emma and Olivier, which I think are very good ones, like bringing in sort of like the business perspective, but also understanding that it's iterative and that there's a role to be played for fundamental research and also commercialization at the same time. Alexander and Mathieu, you guys that are companies that active in this space, how do you see this?
So my opinion on that is that VC is really almost a key requirement if you want to make this vision of a quantum ecosystem happen, because I mean, we have a lot of public funding and it's great to see this. So this is I think it's a huge achievement. It's also a requirement, but there's still a gap between funding of fundamental research and the go-to-market. So there's still a gap that needs to be bridged, and that's why we need, particularly need in the very beginning for this spin-off and the first years of spin-off companies that develop these quantum technologies and that have a huge capital need. Actually, as Olivier said, you don't do this in the in your garage. You do this close to a lab. You need expensive equipment. Typically, you need a lot of hardware. You need a lot of expertise, and that is expensive. This requires a lot of capital, and there we need to bridge the gap because unfortunately we still lack public funding for this early stage of deep tech companies. And there I see a huge demand that can be served also by VC. And I think it's also a great chance for VC to now benefit from this development of the whole market and ecosystem.
So anything you'd want to add there, Mathieu?
I can pretty much back up the idea that there's this very well-known value at death in the TRL level. It's also a value at death in the funding when you look at particular public investment. So this is where, I guess, when we talk about seed and Series A, really that kind of funding that allows the young startups to get to the market, that's really where VC plays a key role. I can add one more word, which is specific to Switzerland, because we're in Switzerland here. It's this one country where there is no politics of industry, right? There is no direct support from the government aligned to a certain industry strategy, right? So for startups in Switzerland, I'd say the funding through VCs is even more so important, because you cannot get very easily this type of funding, and I'm talking about significant funding from the governments, right? So we still can access to Europe when it's possible. Recent news is like it's more complicated, but hopefully, like the institutions are trying to make the bridge. So in short, I'm saying it works well in Switzerland, but VCs are even more so important, I think, in our specific context. There is no bank of public investment like you have in France. There is no high-tech Gründerfonds and package stimuli like in Germany. So it's a bit different here.
So this is, I mean, what we have now is quite a European perspective, because that's where all of us are based. But how would you, this is a question from the audience, how does Europe compare to the US and China in regards to how advanced the quantum ecosystem is?
So if I can take the first part of the answer, I think this is actually, so there are two parts to that answer. The first part is technology-wise. Europe is actually extremely well positioned in terms of the technology that we have here and the know-how that we have here. I think I would consider we have a lead on if you look at the range of quantum opportunities, sensing, crypto, and computing. On the other side of the coin is the financing. And for those in the audience that have followed quantum a bit, you have probably seen like really huge investment round happening overseas in the range of hundreds of millions, an IPO at $1 billion valuation or more. So I think now is the time where we can lose that race. But we have a lot to argue about here.
Would anyone else like to add to that?
Yeah, I think there is funding, and I would even add a third element kind of to the equation, and that is talent, because that's the one thing that is lacking in the whole world. So it's also a lot about who, if you look into different geographies, who has the best access to talent. And I think so far that is also why Europe has been doing pretty well, because there are enough hubs, there are enough universities to kind of foster that community of new people coming to startups. And then, but in the US, as the funding grows, you also are able to attract more and more people there. And I think that's kind of the danger that you now maybe see, and where you can lose the race, as Mathieu said, is if also we have a talent drain from Europe to the US. And then, I mean, Asia, or specifically China, for example, that's a different story. And that's always a bit difficult because they play in a different kind of ecosystem than, for example, the US and Europe do. So it's also harder. There's less visibility of what's going on there. So every once in a while, there are big publications, and there's definitely a lot happening there. But again, their access to talent is sometimes also restricted. So I think that really talent is kind of a central point that everybody runs into, and whoever does that best, acquiring the best talent, will likely win the race. And luckily, there is also quite some common feeling in Europe that people want to build European leaders and want to build the European hub. And I think if you can keep that feeling, then you really have a chance in the race.
If we think of, I mean, you guys now touched upon, I'd say, two important components for like sort of the development of the future of quantum. One is capital and talent. Like if you think about like quantum scaling in the future, what would you say are the other critical components, or how do you see the status of these in the coming years? Would it be, I don't know, industrial acceptance, or like what do you see as the critical components for scaling in this industry?
I think, yeah, it's what we have in Europe, and that seems to be working quite well, is the large corporate that will be the users of those technologies. And I believe that we are quite lucky, because the large European companies have shown more interest in quantum technology early on than maybe what we see in the US or in the UK. Companies such as BMW, companies such as Bosch, Airbus as well. And that provides a lot of opportunity for product development, collaborations, or even financing, because or working on consortium to develop products for the young startups in Europe. I think it's a big chance that we have, and I hope it will remain that way.
Maybe Mathieu, Alexander, you can talk a little bit about sort of like your experience with working together with big players, and what kind of interest you see and from which geographies.
Yeah, sure. Maybe before that, I think I just wanted to comment on your question. What is going to be important for scaling? I think like talent is definitely a top priority. The other one goes back to capital. We need pretty strong investments into the infrastructure. You have to understand that in many cases, not every single case, but in many cases, these quantum technology rely on new materials, new fabrication processes, new technology, right? So these production lines are pretty much non-existent right now, and they cost if you want to make them happen, right? So Either you are in a US mindset and you raise all that money for yourself, or you really have to think Europe. And I think this was my second point. Beside capital, I see a threat with the questions of national sovereignty and a tendency to kind of silo a bit what could happen in this country, in that country, in this other country. When I think putting resources in common and making, for example, big fabs could make sense.
On the other hand, I think if you look into initiatives of different countries, of course that there should be a common sense, and exactly like you say, Mathieu, there is an infrastructure to be built. On the other hand, I think that the fact that Europe also still consists of different countries is, for the funding part, at least also an opportunity, because in the US it's always going to be one government that sets up one program. But if you, maybe with a bit more money, but if you add up what every single country in Europe is putting into the race, and also pushing their national players a bit, maybe to also work with national startups and work together. It's kind of a give and take there. We need an overarching infrastructure, and on the other hand, it's maybe also good to create a bit of competitiveness for the funding side.
I hear the point, but I'm not sure if I fully share that that view. And sorry, David, I forgot your question then because it was...
No, but I mean, if you don't agree, I'd like to hear maybe Alexander's position. What do you think about what Emma just said?
Well, at least for us, it's a nice situation because we're not Switzerland based. So at least for us, I can tell we benefit a lot from national funding. We even benefit from state funding. So there's state funding, there's national funding, there's European funding. So we benefit a lot from this funding situation. Which I like. And for us, this is crucial. It's an essential part of our financing mix. And it was a pre-requirement also for us to start up at all. I think that's okay. As concerns your question about what is required to scale, I'm not sure whether I got the question completely, but I think it cannot be answered that quickly. You have to look at this technology-wise, and it's very different from for various verticals. I think what is similar for all verticals that at some point it may require really breakthrough innovation, because at some point we will be stuck if we just continue to follow the roadmaps that we're working on right now. So I think that's true for computing, for communication, and to some extent also for sensing. And I see this also as a huge chance, mainly for us in Europe, because as has been said before, we have a lot of talent here, and I would back Mathieu saying that perhaps Europe in that sense is even in a leading position. So it's all about to get the ideas, the talent, and this breakthrough innovation really out of the universities, the research groups into the market, back it up with the required funding to really make it happen.
Gotcha. And I think to go back to my initial question that was tied to what Olivier said, that it's what you have in Europe is also a lot of large corporations that are willing to work on the topic of quantum. And you have a lot of big players that are interested to work with young companies that are active in this area. So going back to that question, Mathieu and Alexander, what's your experience in terms of collaborating with large companies? Where do they come from? What's their willingness? Maybe you could share some of your insights on that topic.
So in the first years, we had a lot of what I ended up calling quantum tourism, where we had like even the big execs of large companies coming to our university room. It was in some cases pretty funny. I wish I could have made pictures to show you today. So that was obviously them trying to understand what's going on. But out of that, a few key collaboration were born. I can talk about one example with a Japanese company we collaborate with for the distribution of our product. In their case, they have a strong interest in the technology, and they see this collaboration as a way to learn what's the market potential, and hopefully make their decision later to acquire or not such technology or move in this space with their own means. So I think for them, it was a solid chance to learn, and for us, it was a great opportunity to benefit from a large scale network, because they are already now investing in understanding, selling, developing, and pushing our technology worldwide. So there are those situations for us where collaborations with these large company are really beneficial. Large, I mean, it's a 2 billion company, just to give orders of magnitude here.
Alexander, what about you and your experience here?
Well, my experiences are rather good. So we have a very good exchange also with larger companies that are either interested in really using our products. So there we really collaborate very closely which also allows us to improve our products. So we try to reflect what is also needed by these companies in our product development. My feeling is that the exchange is a bit more open within Europe compared to talking to prospects, customers in the US who are slightly more careful as concerns the exchange of information, for instance. But still, the exchange is very good, and it's still. I still have the feeling that we're quite often talk to very similar personas, so to speak. So we're still talking to end users, for instance, to have a good understanding of the technology itself, how it is used, and what is required to implement it at the customer side. And that's very helpful. But I think this will also diverge in the near future.
Would you, Olivier or Emma, want to add anything to this on you, maybe Olivier, from your perspective of your other portfolio companies?
Oh, maybe one thing that's important as well is public order, and having states or the EU that are passing orders or organizing tenders for our companies. And this is something that we've seen a lot in the past in the US. For the US company, they are all funded by orders from the Department of Energy or Department of Defense, with significant orders that can be several million. And it's something that we did not do well in Europe, but I think now Europe is switching gears. And with the EIC projects or accelerators and so on, now I think there's an understanding in the public authorities that grants are fine, supporting the research is fine, but you also need to buy from the startups, which is the best way for them to develop, since that you put them in business. By doing that, you force them to meet the challenges, to develop their products in a timely manner. So I think it's something that's changing, and it's happening right now. I mean, public order is also a good thing for all those companies and for the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think maybe just one also a bit different example to add. I think especially there has been for a long while quite a gap between the end users and the hardware producers, because it was very hard in the initial era basically to kind of go to the end user and say, yes, so I'm developing this, and the end user was, but I don't know how to use it. And this is actually interesting that now a lot of these quantum software players also emerge. And then if you have interesting collaborations there, and this is happening on an ongoing basis, there was even the merger of Cambridge Quantum Computing with a part of Honeywell that is working on hardware, where they really need each other to get to the end customer. Obviously, the software players need the hardware players to be able to run something, to actually run the algorithms that they develop. But I also think the hardware players, especially in computing, they need those software players to even have kind of a bridge to the end user to show them what their hardware could do. And I think this is also something that is now happening more because there are more players, and there are more smaller players or similar size players that can collaborate, and that can also show the customers in a more tangible way, hey, this is what we together could do for you.
I think that's a really good point you're touching upon, Emma, and one where we should maybe just, also for the sake of the lay person like myself, I mean, there's very different applications in the quantum space. And I think a lot of people, when they think of quantum, they think immediately of quantum computing. How would you lay down sort of like what are the different areas of application, and how far developed are they? Because I have also a lot of questions here from the audience around the topic of quantum computing and revenues and the development of this. But I think it would be interesting to hear from the four of you how you see the industry, like what you see as the different spaces, and what are the development times in these different areas.
I mean, I can start with kind of the general picture, and you guys can fill in because you're actually in that industry. But I think kind of the classical division of this industry is along three areas. So we have the quantum computing, we have quantum sensing. I will let Mathieu say more about that, and then we also have quantum communication or quantum networks. And I think Alexander, you're also a good person to comment there. And they do have very different development timelines. They're also not completely independent of each other. They depend on each other actually to work, because I mean quantum networks or quantum communication that also goes again into a lot of different areas. So it's in the future also about, hey, if we have one quantum computer and we have another one, how do we actually let them talk to each other, and how do we make sure that I as the user in the middle can actually get my information from the quantum computing that I can access via the cloud. But then I mean we need an infrastructure for that. And for example, on the sensing side, we're almost pretty close to industrialization. We're almost there. Mathieu can comment on that. And then also on the communication side, but what is a hot topic now is, for example, this cryptography. Because quantum has kind of this unique ability to physically secure information, because it's just a quantum property that if I send a state from one end to the other, if somebody takes a look in the middle or tries to get out that information, the end user will know. You can observe that the information has been tampered. And that's, of course, a very interesting concept that can lead to a lot of security. And then, I mean, quantum computing is the big promise that kind of builds also upon the innovations in the other fields. But that's then also the one with the longest timeline.
Thanks, Emma. That's a really good overview. But as you said, it would be great to now have the three of you also maybe add some contours and some color to that.
Maybe if I totally agree with how Emma presented the landscape. Now, we are very often referring to these technologies are long term, but in fact, we've been quite surprised about the way and the speed at which the companies and the product develop. And there, I mean, we have in our 14 portfolio companies, I would say that there is more than half of them that are already into revenues and sometimes significant revenues. Mathieu can, of course, illustrate that. Some of them, if we take, for example, Pascal, they've sold 2 machines that will be delivered next year. So they are starting to sell product. And I think, although it's a long-term play, but still, we are getting there quite rapidly, and some companies are already into very classical business model, selling product, selling solutions, and so the timeline can be long, but there are some intermediate steps where you can already deliver things that are valuable to your client and make revenues out of it. If you look at software companies, it's a bit difficult software in quantum because you do not have the machines yet to run your software on. However, those companies have started developing algorithms. They can emulate their software on classical machine, and then they will take it to quantum whenever it's necessary. But in the meantime, they can still develop use cases and approaches with their clients. So it's a bit of consulting, which is not something that we like very much in VC because it's not scalable. But still, they are doing some pretty decent revenues, and they are learning for their client. And when the time comes in 2 or 3 years, and they have the relevant machines to put their software on, then there will be a market. So it's not just a play that will happen in 10 years. There are some intermediate steps where you can already start creating value and making revenues.
Almost nothing to add to what Emma already pictured. So we have these verticals. So these are typical verticals that are mentioned. I'd like to emphasize once more that there are really a lot of interconnections between these verticals. So consider, for instance, communications. To implement communication networks, you will need high efficiency detectors. So that is part of the sensing vertical. And that also holds for if you would like to exchange information between quantum computers end of the day. So again, this involves quantum communication, which again involves quantum sensing. So even though we are talking about these various industries, they're still closely connected and they develop at slightly different pace. I believe that sensing and communication are a bit ahead of at least universal computing, but the last years I got the impression that computing really has become much faster. There has been a huge progress, which is also due to the growing number of players working in the field and the larger competition and the more money spent of that into that development, of course.
Maybe I talk about the sensing part a bit more specifically. I think I already mentioned an application in the semiconductor industry, or maybe in science first. Now it's fair to say that's what's mature or maturing right now in the semiconductor industry research, and hopefully then inline. Here the timescale is more like, I'd say, over 5 years. That's the time you need to get in these type of environments if you're successful all along the way. It's the standard in the industry. Emma also mentioned medical imaging. There is also biosensing. There are extremely interesting startups which detect biomolecules. Here, the value proposition is enhanced sensitivity so that you can detect what is called their rare events, so a tiny amount of particles for as early as possible diagnostics. I would say that for us at Qnami, the long-term vision for the company is really to develop a sensing technology in general, maybe be an OEM provider of these sensor solution, an equivalent to Bosch, if you want, for the quantum world, quantum sensor. And here, there's really a wealth of application, right? I mentioned sensitivity. Everywhere where you want to make a detection which is sensitive to weaker signals, either because they're very small or because they're very diffuse, you may have a point. But there's another hidden advantage of quantum systems. They are self-calibrated. We're talking about single particles, which in many cases behave the same one from the next one. They're all the same. So they're kind of self-calibrated, extremely reproducible and robust. So we are discussing a range of applications for sensing in tough environments where other sensing approaches are difficult because you have noise, because you have dust, because you have all these stuffs, and then you need to often go back for maintenance, etc., and recalibrate, etc., etc. So I can speak for applications in this direction too. And here, timescale, to just say a final word about this. You could even dream automotive. In fact, some serious players think about it. The main challenge here, the time horizon is longer, and the main challenge is price. For now, the price of a quantum sensor remains high because it's not scaled at all. So if we want to go to a mass market of quantum sensors, I think here the timeline is also 5 to 10 years because of the infrastructure that is needed and the investment that is needed so that you can produce at reasonable costs.
Maybe just one point. I mean, we've talked a lot about like young companies. We've talked about VCs, but like, what role do actually large corporates have in driving innovation in this space?
I'm gonna give a first part to the answer. I think they're critical, not necessarily because they do the work. I do believe that startups and SMEs are actually the engine of the whole ecosystem, but and it's absolutely normal. The layman can relate to what the big companies do and where they look at. So they're extremely important in showing the direction, in revealing that the ecosystem exists, that the applications are worth of interest.
Of course, at this stage of many parts of the quantum industry, you still ask for quite a risk appetite, right? You ask for kind of upfront time investment to spend time with you to figure out what is needed from the corporate. But that's exactly the kind of effort that they need to make. As in any industry, they need to provide these SMEs, these startups, with kind of their requirements. Like, how do you want the machine to work? Because, and that's not only about what do you want it to do, but also how can I interact with it. And I think if the big corporates, and some of them are, the early adopters, are taking a risk. They are buying into a roadmap. They're not yet buying products maybe today, but they're buying into, hey, I'm committed to getting you to that product level that is useful for me. And also by connecting them to other parties. Hey, you can provide me this part. I'm in contact with this party that can provide me another one. How will we connect that for our specific use case? So I think they're providing the requirement. That's really the task of these large corporations.
Maybe just a very concrete example that when you set up a consortium to answer a tender, if you have a startup with 5 to 10 people, it's going to be difficult to dedicate 2 full-time resources to build the consortium, go through all the legal and administrative stuff. And so that's also where those large companies can have a role and dedicate some resource and try to engage with several startups to build a consortium and act as one group in front of authorities or the people that issue the tender.
And we're almost at the end of our time. We have 3 minutes left. Is there any last sort of statement, if you think about this conversation we had, like any closing remark that you think you would want to add to what's already been said?
Maybe just to come back on the earlier question about American companies going through SPACs, raising hundreds of millions, and are we going to be able to compete in Europe? Well, I believe that, we have the resources because there are as many scientific publications coming from Europe as scientific publication coming from the US in the quantum field. So we have the researchers, we have the resources. Now the question, I believe, we are at a turning point because there are some early stage money available for the startups. I wouldn't say easily, but at least for the good ones. But now the question is, are we going to be able to attract the growth fund to fund large rounds of 200 million, 300 million, and to remain in the same league as the American competitors. And I believe the time is now because we have companies that have started maturing and growing, such as Kiutra and such as Qnami. Their next round, they are going to need some sizable amount of money. And if we are not able to find it in Europe, and that's where the US competitors will do the shopping. And we've started witnessing that in our portfolio. After the IonQ SPAC, there has been several of our portfolio companies that have been approached. And I mean, at some point, so they prefer to grow their business and to find their own investor. But at some point, if that becomes difficult, then they will become a target for foreign companies.
I mean, from the, like, I'm just thinking from the perspective of a VC that has portfolio companies in the space. If the money comes from the US, I mean, I think, Alexander, you take it, right?
Well, of course, at the moment, we try to stay, at least for the moment, we try to stay within Europe. But honestly, Europe is different in terms of VC, and you all know this, so I don't have to tell you. And we learned that a lot during the last month. And there's a huge interest also from the US and even also from Asia in companies like us in the quantum business. So I see this also as a chance, of course, to grow our business after the next round or after this round. I'd still like to see more European financing into this business, and I see it also as in view of the concern Mathieu mentioned. So technical sovereignty, for instance, and we don't want to get into dependency here concerning the financing of companies in the future. So I think it's important to get further funding also for sizable rounds in the near future.
Perfect. So I think, I mean, on that, it's 1 o'clock. I'm sure everyone has to get back to their days. I'd like to thank Emma, Mathieu, Alexander, Olivier again for taking the time. Really appreciated this talk, and from the feedback we've gotten from the audience, them as well. As mentioned, I'll be sharing the recording with all participants. And again, to all of you, thank you so much for attending, and wishing you a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.